You're listening to Big World Network.
Accidental Passion, Episode 7, Mayday Part 3, read by Meagan Hedin. Warning! Although there is no material subject matter within that couldn't be found in any general bookstore with no age constraint, this series is rated 18 and contains adult situations and content. It is intended for mature audiences only and should not be read if you are uncomfortable with graphic sexual intimacy. Ryan liked the challenge of the unexpected, which he examined with his best-selling novels, often taking a twist that seemed insurmountable, but with the hero always finding a solution. It was for that same reason that flying had been a passion of his for so many years. He liked the challenges of working with the equipment, weather, air traffic control, and his own limitations, always working towards the safe outcome of each flight. He had joked once to a friend over a few drinks that it wasn't at all unlike an 18-year-old attempting to have sex with his date. It was a constant balance between lack of experience and sheer persistence in hormones, an understanding of his date's desires and feelings, avoiding pushing too soon and too much, or being too slow and too timid, resulting in a change of mind. Ryan knew this was uniquely a male's perspective, but he also knew it was a fairly accurate analogy to flying. Above all else, the 18-year-old would stay focused on the end result until clearly failing or reaching a successful outcome. Flying a jet was no different. The outcome tonight was not in question, and there was no doubt in Ryan's mind that despite the jammed flight controls, his landing would be successful. He knew the limits of his own abilities and those of his jet, and he trusted in his training and experience. It was this certainty that allowed him to remain calm despite the increased adrenaline as he began the final approach into LAX airport in the dark cockpit. Approaching from the west over the Pacific Ocean, he was amazed at the number of lights filtering through his line of vision with the Los Angeles skyline, the brightly lit runways and scores of rescue equipment surrounding the runway he was lining up on. But it was only the runway he focused on, judging his descent angle and making adjustments as best he could with the heavy control loads. He noticed a tendency to over-control when reducing the nose-down attitude, since it was just a matter of relaxing pressure against the control wheel. It took a few moments to gauge the forces required before he was able to reduce the pitch oscillations, trying to find the balance in forces. Looking at his airspeed on the glass display, basically a digital flat screen projection of the traditional flight instruments, he knew his airspeed was too high still for a safe landing. Adjusting the power would change the forces required on the controls that were working against the jam-trim servos, as would changing the flap configuration, which normally allowed the jet to reduce airspeed while maintaining adequate lift. Ryan had some decisions to make, and would have to be ready for anything and to quickly undo any changes he made if the result was too unstable. As he approached the shoreline on final approach for the runway, he moved the landing gear handle to the down position. With the gear now out and the power reduced a little more, he felt he could slow to a safe speed without having to use any flaps and change his current forces on the control yoke. Feeling the strain in his arms from the constant forces required, he was glad it would be over in moments, one way or another. Taking a deep breath and exhaling, he said to himself, "Here we go," as his jet flew low over the runway approach lights. Angela had been in a fantastic mood despite the emergency, and had become so involved with her media calls and phone interviews that the reality of the situation became minimized in her mind. Knowing that there was live news coverage on all of the 24-hour news networks and that she and her client were on center stage in the country right now had kept her nicely distracted. But, as she looked out her window and watched as the dark ocean below suddenly became the bright Los Angeles coastline, and it became apparent how close they were now to the ground, her previous focused energy changed to pure panic. She gripped the leather armrests on the corporate jet's upholstered chair, closed her eyes, and silently hoped her client was as competent and confident as he seemed, as she waited for the thud of the landing gear to touch down on the ground. Kim, still sitting up in bed watching the live news coverage unfold with Kevin reading beside her, silently reflected on how many evenings past she had laid in bed thinking of Ryan, often fantasizing about him while touching herself. Those thoughts of pleasure were now replaced with fear for his safety and the horror of possibly losing him from her life. It wasn't until this evening that she realized just how much she truly loved him. It all seemed ridiculously surreal to her. Just hours ago she had proclaimed her love to him as he entered her, filling her, his body tight against hers. And now she was watching live video of his jet circling Los Angeles with news anchors and commentators discussing the risks involved landing with his particular emergency. Then came the thought of her phone conversation with Woods and the possibility that, because of her poor judgment in character and affair with Rick, he may have actually somehow been involved with the mechanical failure. So overwhelmed, Kim only wanted this to be over, and with a safe outcome. Finally, the reporter announced that the jet was beginning its final approach after burning off as much fuel as possible. Kim sat up even more, almost leaning towards the flat screen mounted on their bedroom wall, and found it very hard to conceal her anticipation and fear for the man she loved from Kevin lying beside her. She wanted to feel Ryan inside of her again, to somehow erase the last few hours and have him safely in her arms, feeling his lips on hers. As Ryan attempted to raise the nose for touchdown in his jet, he had to concentrate on his control inputs both laterally and vertically. It was the vertical up and down controlling that was requiring the most focus. Normally, he would be pulling back on the yoke to raise the nose, allowing the main gear to touch first. But with the jammed trim affecting the flight controls, he was required to still push forward on the yoke and relax just the right amount of pressure. Trying hard not to drive the nose into the runway or release too much pressure, which would cause the jet to float back up, Ryan adjusted his outside scan in the dark with the bright runway edge lights below him, judging his distance. At what he felt was the right moment, he relaxed just enough pressure on the controls to allow the nose to raise up slightly above the horizon of lights. To his relief and amusement, the main wheels touched down on one of the smoothest landings he had ever made. Still rolling down the runway at over 130 knots, he began to push forward on the yoke to counter the control forces and land the nose gear without letting it slam down onto the runway. Once it was down and all three landing gears were in contact with the runway, he continued to push forward and simultaneously apply maximum braking, slowing the aircraft down until it was at a safe speed and he could let go of the controls. Finally, having the tension gone from his arm muscles, Ryan shook them vigorously. Even before he was able to taxi clear of the runway, with rescue vehicles racing towards them, Angela was behind him slapping his shoulder. "Now it's time to reap your rewards for your talent as a pilot with the media," she said. All Ryan could say in reply, still feeling the adrenaline racing through his body, was, "Are you fucking kidding me?"
This has been a presentation of Big World Network. Visit us on bigworldnetwork.com for more free weekly series, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to Big World Network.